I invite Jan Bowen to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in the affirmation of covenant printed in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service, saying,
Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus we covenant with each other.
And I messed up, I forgot to use the mic. Maybe my voice didn't need it.
Our speaker this morning is Dr. Janet Lanza, and she is going to talk about ways to bless those seeds I sow in a new way, in a new future-looking way to protect Mother Earth. She is an emeritus professor of biology at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. As an ecologist, she focused her research on plant-animal interactions. As an educator, she focused her activities on the development and implementation of student-generated experiments in biology labs. She is the author of more than 50 professional journal articles and the mentor of more than 100 undergraduate researchers. Currently, she is serving as president of the Central Arkansas Master Naturalists and coordinator of Arkansas Wild Spaces, a program that helps homeowners learn how to know what native plants would suit their yards and other ways to improve their yards for wildlife. In her spare time, she uses her time to write, lecture, garden, play tennis, and travel. In fact, she just got back late last night from traveling, so we're really grateful that she is here. Dr. Lanza?
Thank you, Linda, for your introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for your attention. I've listened to the last three sermons, so I know you're thinking about global change and quality of life, about gardening, gardens, and sacred places, and activism. And I think my talk meshes well with all of those, but I hope my approach is not too much of a shock because it's very different than what you've heard in the last 3 weeks. Did you get the slides up, Chad? Yeah. So I like to call this talk, If You Plant It, They Will Come. Here we go, okay. Thank you, Chad, that was helpful. All right, so if you plant it, they will come. Next slide shows you what I'm, didn't flip. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so this looks like a cornfield, but it's not. It's actually basket flower plants in my garden, and I, can you hear me? Am I?
You lift the mic closer to your mouth.
There was some feedback, is why I stepped back. All right, how's this? Can you hear me in the back? Oh, okay, good, okay. All right, so when I walked by and saw this, I thought, oh, that looks just like Field of Dreams, where the baseball players came out of the fields, the ghosts, and they wanted to play another game. But that's what gave me the inspiration for this, for the title of this. Next slide. Now we get to the depressing part. Bird numbers in North America are down by 29% since 1980. 3 billion birds fewer than we had then. Next, click, yeah. And insect numbers are down 9% for each of the last 3 decades. 3 bumblebee species are extinct. Many of them are, others are at risk of extinctions, and other bees numbers are down considerably. So next slide. This is Doug Tallamy. He's an ecologist, he's an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he has connected these 2 facts. Next, click. All right, so next. He says that the increase in non-native plants is contributing to much of the insect decline. All right, non-native plants, plants that came from other continents, sometimes from other parts of this continent, but we have invasive species, ones that are not native to North America, and they take over natural places. We also have a lot of ornamental plants in our yards. You know, I'm not going to give up my gardenias. I'm from the north. I love having gardenias and camellias here, but they are not native to North America. So Tallamy argues that this increase in non-native plants has contributed to the insect decline. Next slide, or next click. And he then argues that the insect decline causes the bird decline, which sounds sort of weird. But if we go to the next slide, I'll try and explain this. Next. Insects like to eat plants, but plants don't like losing their photosynthetic ability. So over evolutionary time, plants have evolved protective chemicals. Next slide. And insects, in response, have evolved protections against those chemicals, but they have only evolved protections against those chemicals for the things that they have been around. Next slide. So they can't deal with the protective chemicals in non-native plants. Next slide. So if native plants are not present, insect populations decline. So that's why there is a connection between the presence of non-native plants and the decline in insects. Next slide. We need to ask a question. Next slide. Okay. Why does an insect decline cause, why does an insect decline cause a bird decline? So this slide shows you a insect damage on some leaves and not on others. In the foreground are leaves that are entire, they're not eaten, but behind them are leaves that are chewed a lot. Those branches come from the same rootstock. The front leaves are Japanese persimmon grafted onto the rootstock of a native North American persimmon. And that rootstock sent up its own leaves. So there are 2 different sets of genes. One is native, the ones that are chewed. One is non-native, the ones that aren't chewed. I think this slide is a really good illustration of how insects eat natives but not non-natives. So if we have insects on natives, what's the connection to birds? So, and let me say, I love to tell this. Butterfly females, are great botanists. They only lay their eggs on native plants and on the native plants that they have the genes to eat, all right, so that they can tolerate the chemicals. Next slide. So, why butterflies? Well, caterpillars are terrific baby food for birds. They're soft, so when the adult bird stuffs the food down the throats of the baby birds, there aren't spines that stick out and harm the throats. They're also very high in fats, very high in protein, and carotenoids, which is a particular group of chemicals that helps with the immune system and helps birds produce the bright colors that you see in them. Next slide. So, they're perfect baby food. You see a chickadee? Everybody knows what a chickadee is. The parents feed the babies in the nest for about 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, they have to bring 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. I mean, you don't see it oaks here host over 400 species of caterpillars, but they don't look like they're eaten to bits. So we still see our oaks, the caterpillars are not doing huge damage to them, but they are producing caterpillars that birds can feed to the babies. Next slide. Even hummingbirds, you think of hummingbirds just eating nectar, put out hummingbird feeders. Well, they collect tiny insects and lots of spiders and feed to their babies. Next slide. So, we'll leave that for just a minute. Talamy further argues, next slide, that 86% of the land in North America, east of the Mississippi, is privately owned. So we are not going to make new preserves for butterflies, birds. Can't do it. There's not enough land. Next slide. The lawn acreage in the U.S. is the size of New England. And Talamy sees that as an opportunity. Next slide. Talamy argues that we should turn our yards into a homegrown national park so that we plant natives, we produce insects, and insects help produce birds. So how do we do that? Next slide. I want you to compare the front of this slide. There's a lot of lawn there. There are a couple of small trees planted, but look behind the house. Which side is going to produce more insects? Not the desert that you see in front of the house, but the trees that you see behind it. Next slide. How do we go from this desert of lawn to our homegrown national park? We need to redesign our residential plantings. On the left, well, both of these slides show two different gardens, or these images, two different gardens, both of which are being converted to lots more native plants. On the left is mine. There's some bee balm, there's some purple coneflower, but there are other things, tiger lilies in the background, that are not native. And I am not planting more non-natives. As non-natives in my yard die, I'm going to put more natives in there. The same thing is true in the yard on the left. So we have something that's full sun, but then we have a garden that's in the shade. We can do it in both. Next slide. If you want to make your yard a homegrown national park, your first step is to remove the invasive species. These are those non-natives that are going to crowd out natives. It can be a big job. It can take a lot of persistence and a lot of energy, but it can be done. And there are a variety of methods that you can use. On the left, you see the pitchfork. You can dig them up sometimes. I know people sometimes have some big plants that they have to pull out with a tractor. Well, there are other ways you can do that. In the middle, the next image, you see a cut stem. So you can use your loppers to cut a stem and then use a paintbrush to put on herbicide. And that is a very specific way to kill a plant. You don't have to spray it. The next slide, what do you do about a tree? Well, you can cut, go back, please. You can cut the tree with a chainsaw if it's big enough, and then paint the outer rim with your paintbrush containing herbicides. The top right picture there shows how I'm trying to get rid of Nandina. I cut it back and I covered it with a plastic bag. Now, these sneaky devils have branched out under the plastic, so when I walk by, I look, and when I see a new little stem, I just pull it off. It's going to take months for this to happen, but it will kill the plant. Next slide. Your next step after you get rid of, as you get rid of invasives, is to add native plants that provide wildlife food all year round. Also, maybe provide nesting spaces or nesting materials for them. The bottom left image shows a plant that provides nectar to hummingbirds. The image to the right shows a giant swallowtail caterpillar, and you can see that it has eaten from the edge of that leaf. And this is the biggest butterfly in North America, and it's this big. So that's food. You have to let them eat your plants. And Doug Tallamy says, if you don't like the way the plants look, because there are some leaves eaten, you should follow his 10-step program. And his 10-step program is to move back 10 steps, and you won't see the damage. I wish that were my line, but it's Doug Tallamy's. Another thing you can do is you need to provide fruit and food for birds. And the top image is an American strawberry bush where, you'd think these colors just didn't go together, but the orange and the red are so striking. The birds come along, pick out the fruit inside that capsule, and then they digest the covering of the seeds and then poop out the seed, thus dispersing it. The right-hand side is an image of grass, and grasses produce seed for birds. They also produce nesting materials for birds to collect. They also produce nesting materials for bees, and also overwintering sites for bumblebee queens, for example. So you want to have food available from February or March into November. So you want diversity in your plantings. Next slide. So I'm hoping you're getting the message that I'm saying. If you plant it, meaning native plants, insects and birds, will come. And I know people who have said, since I've started planting natives, I'm seeing a lot more butterflies and birds in my yard. Next slide. I think everybody agrees that this is a good idea, but what do I do if I don't know which ones are native and which ones are invasive? And what if I don't know what native plants I should put in the backyard versus the front yard? That's where Arkansas Wild Spaces comes in. Next slide. What you do is you ask us to come and visit your place. So we visit yards. We spend maybe 2 hours talking to the homeowners, and we recommend what people should do in their yard. Next slide. What do we do when we visit a yard? We look at the yard. We walk around with the homeowner. Visits typically take 2 hours. Most people, we do have a small charge for it. Most people, if you have less than half an acre, you most likely pay $20, though we do have some ability for people in need where we can reduce the fee. So we look at what is there, and we explain Talamy's philosophy. Next slide. We listen to the homeowners because we want to know, is that crepe myrtle, which is not an invasive, but is an ornamental that doesn't do any good for anybody in terms of wildlife. But maybe that particular crepe myrtle is their grandmother's, is a shoot stock from their grandmother's favorite tree, and that's important to them. So we listen to what's important, how do they want to use the various parts of their property. You know, we've got to have, this is a report that I'm writing right now, we need the backyard to have an open space so the dog can run, and we don't want any plants with poisonous fruit because our dog eats everything. So, you know, you take those things into account. We need a place for the kids to play. I want a butterfly meadow. You know, we listen, or at least we try to listen to what people want their yards to be. Do they want it formal, informal? You know, there's all kinds of different gardens. Next slide. This is the only part in this report, in this talk, where I'm going to be very specific. I'm going to show you the 5 most obnoxious invasives. Privet, and you can tell privet because in the winter it's green. You drive down some road and you see this green shrubbery, could be 10, 12 feet high. Privet. It has nice yellow flower or white flowers. Bees go to it. It is good for bees. There's also blue fruit. Birds eat that fruit, but it's not particularly nutritious because native fruits are high in fats and proteins, and privet fruits are mostly sugar. So it does help them some, but not as much as a native plant would. So that's privet. Next slide shows Bradford pears, which everybody, you know, builders put them in because they grow fast, they give you pretty white flowers that maybe smell terrible and are not visited particularly frequently by bees. I do think Bradford pears are prettier in the fall than they are in the spring because they do have nice red color. But the picture on the left shows planted privets. The one on the right is a field where they have the fruits have been dispersed and they have grown up. So it is definitely an invasive plant. Next slide. Honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle. There are 2 species of native honeysuckle that really are nice. They're pretty, they're beneficial to wildlife, but as you see in the right-hand picture there, honeysuckle just can grow over everything. But it does produce nectar, it does produce some fruit. Next slide. English ivy. It's a great ground cover because it covers up the bare space and it spreads. Don't let it grow on your house. Get rid of it. This is probably the plant that I think is the hardest to get rid of because it can cover a big space really quickly, and you just have to be very persistent. Next slide. This is the last one. This is Nandina. These are my plants before I didn't plant them, please. These are my plants before I cut them down. So there's red fruit. The fruit can be toxic to birds. The leaves can be toxic. They have cyanides in them. But one of these is a plant that I showed you with the black plastic bag over it. So, another 6 months, I'm predicting they're going to, this is a good plant because it's evergreen in the winter. And the red berries are nice. It's still being sold. Janet Carson likes it because it's evergreen. And she says there are plants now, they've developed some hybrids that don't have the red fruit. I don't trust it because mutations occur that may restore the fruiting ability. So I would cut down every single privet. I would cut down every single Nandina. These are plants that I know of people who have pulled them out with a tractor. So they're pretty tough plants. So those are the 5 most invasive species around here. But there are a lot more. Next slide. So we're still thinking about what does a visit from AWS entail. We find invasives, show people which were invasives. If they know them, that's great. If they don't and they're not sure they'll remember, we put a piece of flagging around it with the name on it. What we then do is we're looking around to see what should they do, what could they do with the different parts of their yard. This particular yard, there's some trees over there. I'm not sure what's underneath it. It might be English ivy. If you got rid of the English ivy and put some smaller shrubs, some herbaceous perennials, flowering things, you provide soft ground under the trees. The biggest producers of caterpillars are trees, but they don't stay in the trees over the winter. They fall from the tree and either overwinter as pupae in the leaf litter or burrow into the ground. So you don't want lawn that you mow underneath the trees. You want soft ground to allow the caterpillars, pupae, and then adults emerging in the spring to survive the winter. Next slide. We also, during our visit, talk about other actions that people can take to improve their yard for wildlife. People might want to put up bluebird houses, but it depends upon what the area looks like, whether a bluebird house is appropriate. Chickadee houses. Also rain barrels. If you have eaves and downspouts, rain barrels are a free source of water. Wildlife needs water as well, so having some kind of water feature in the yard, probably both in the front and the back, is a really helpful thing. And you might have it on the ground or you might have it elevated. And a brush pile. This is my brush pile. It's bigger right now. You don't have to have a big brush pile, but you can have small brush piles, and you don't have to have it look messy. you can tuck them behind or underneath shrubs. And they provide escape hatches for birds. They provide overwintering spots for a variety of insects. Next slide. All right. What do we do? I'm not expecting you to read this. What do we do after we look at the yard and talk about the philosophy and what people want to do in the yard? We leave, we brainstorm, think, and write a report. It is not in my brain or anybody else, any other habitat advisor, all the plants that could be put in the yard. We have spreadsheets, and they talk about what plant wants sun, moist conditions or sun, and dry conditions. How many caterpillars does it host? What pollinators come to it? All kinds of things. And we use those spreadsheets to figure out good selections for a particular yard. Next slide shows you the beginning of a report. The report is really in 3 parts. And the first part, we talk about non-native invasive plants that are there, what plants we recommend for, in this case, 6 different areas of a yard. This was a particularly complex yard. Next slide, we're not going to just list, we're not going to give you names of 10 species. We are going to give you blurbs that come out of our spreadsheets and describe, a white oak, what kind of sun, what kind of moisture, that has 400, in this area, 420 species of caterpillars that it hosts, and a link to a website where somebody can get an image of the plant, so that not everybody wants to have a white oak, but maybe they would want a Mexican plum. And so they have some choices. Next slide shows the second part of the report, which is how to make a conservation-friendly yard. That's where we would talk about rain barrels, brush piles, things like that. But then we'll talk about improving the environments for overwintering butterflies, moths, and other insects, improving the environment for Lepidoptera, leps. I already explained about the need for soft ground underneath. The next thing we emphasize is improving environments for native bees. We're not talking honeybees. They are not native. The bulk of our bumblebees are native. Your favorites, I'm sure, carpenter bees that burrow into the side of your house, they're native as well. But the majority of our bees are solitary bees, and that means that a single female builds a nest in the ground, in wood, between rocks. She builds a nest in there, usually a tunnel. She lays an egg and goes and collects nectar and pollen for that egg, adds some bee bread to it, closes off the cell, lays another egg, goes and gets more pollen and nectar, and when she's finished doing this, she dies. She never sees her offspring. Most solitary bees, you only get, the adults spend their lives, they spend their lives as adults for only 2 to 6 weeks. So you need a variety of plants flowering from March to November because you want a sequence of solitary bees. So she lays the eggs in April, we'll say. She dies. Those larvae stay in the ground, if that's where the nest was, until the following April. And we elaborate on that a little bit. We talk about, in the report, we talk about chemical killers. We allow 3 exceptions to the no chemical rule. One is, getting rid of the invasives with the paintbrush method that I talked about earlier. Second thing would be BT dunks, which you can buy at Tractor Supply. If you have your water feature and you don't want mosquitoes in there, you can put these dunks in it, and they kill only, it's not only mosquito larvae, they also kill black flies. Both of those things are good. We do talk about that. The third is fire ants, using an insecticide for fire ants that specifically kills or sterilizes the queen. So there are three exceptions to using chemicals. And then education and volunteerism, and that really fits with what your community, what you're trying to do outside this particular community is how do you spread the word. So that's the second part of the report. Next slide shows you the third part of the report, where we recommend actions for the homeowners about what they could do to become certified as an Arkansas wild space. We have 3 levels: silver, gold, and platinum. And we have had a few people who have yards that the first time we visit, we say, oh yes, these 10 criteria, you get a silver in every one, or you get a silver in 8 of them and gold in the other 2. And they can be certified immediately, but if not, we'll come back a second time after the homeowner has made progress. And you don't have to become certified. I used to be a bit of a snob about this. I mean, I don't need to brag that I'm, a certified Monarch Way station, but it is good advertising for the environment. So I have changed my position on that. So if you're certified, you can purchase a sign at cost and display them proudly. Next slide shows certified Arkansas Wild Space. So if you're interested in having a visit, we have some information here, and the church can make more copies if there are more people. You can also go online and search Arkansas Wild Spaces. You should come up to the Central Arkansas Master Naturalists website and click on that button, and it'll help you submit an application. I'll respond. I check every day. We probably, at this point, we probably won't be able to do new application visits until the spring. But we haven't lost anybody's application yet. And so I don't know whether you allow questions on this or not. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. So I'd like to thank you again for your attention, and happy gardening.
Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings. I invite Jan up to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us in Thompson Hall for coffee and lots of good leftover snacks from yesterday and good conversation. Amen. Namaste.